We're going to keep building our quiz app, and in this video, we are going to talk specifically about two concepts relevant to components, props and state. So props we saw last time and components we saw last time, but the relevant documentation page is here under main concepts on the React docs page. Highly recommend you read this. It talks about a functional component, which is the type of component we wrote last time, but also talks about the equivalent class-based component that you could write. We're not going to use this syntax in this course, but it helps to know that that's out there, especially if you're Googling problems that come up. You will often see sample codes that are written in this class syntax. So this goes through how you render a component, how you compose components, etc., etc. Highly recommend reading that. The state and lifecycle page is the relevant documentation page for state when we get into that, which is how do you manage data in your application, especially data that needs to update the user interface when that data changes. So this page goes through talking about how React's lifecycle works and how you manage state in an application. And with that, we are going to jump back into our code. So when we are writing our React application, we have these npm scripts that are defined in our package.json. And these are the things that come, these scripts here, these React scripts, they come with create React app, and they are the thing that allows us to bootstrap our application so that we can compile our JSX, turn it into JavaScript, among a bunch of other things. So the way that we run our React application is not through using the go live server button down here, but instead using our terminal. So we can pop open this terminal window by hitting Control tilde or Control backtick, and then we want to run npm run start, which will run through our application, start a development server, and compile our assets. So I'm going to close these other tabs. So once it compiles, we will either see compiled successfully or we will see errors, and it will give us a link to the local host in our browser that we can paste in to open up our application, or if we want to load it on another device on our network, how to do that via the IP address. So our application is only going to be accessible to us in the browser when this script is running. And this script is watching all of our assets so that when we make changes, like I change this from first to second and check it out in my browser, it will take a second, but it is recompiled and refreshed in the browser. So let's look at a high level at some of the stuff that we did last time. We saw that we were able to restructure our application using the import-export syntax so that we could put each component in its own file. Like we have this app.js inside of our components folder. We created a function, so this is a functional component, and then we said this is exported as the default export from this file, so that other files like index.js could come in and just import that component and then do whatever needs to happen with that component. Here we're rendering that to the page in index.js. Same structure with welcome message. We created a function, we exported it as the default, and then in app we were able to import welcome message and then use that component inside of app. And our welcome message took in what are called props. So in HTML world, we were calling these attributes. Inside of React world, we're calling these props, where anything that we pass in here with this structure of key equals value, shows up in our component as a key on our props object. So this is an object that comes in. We use the destructuring syntax to pull out the value of greeting and the value of name from it. And then we could use those, we could inject those JavaScript variables into our JSX using this bracket syntax. So as soon as we open a curly bracket and close a curly bracket, we are allowed to insert JavaScript into our markup. And here we can actually insert more than just variables. So let me bring our application side by side up here. So instead of just inserting a variable, I can say, here's this JavaScript expression to convert my greeting to lowercase or to uppercase. So inside of these brackets, we can inject any JavaScript expression. So we can't put in things like a for statement, so we can't put statements inside of here, but we can put expressions. So those are things like variables and function calls. Enough review. Let us dig into state. So right now we have an application where nothing changes, there's nothing dynamic about it. So when we started making our application in vanilla HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, we started with creating these buttons that could track the number of times they were clicked, and every time they were clicked, they changed something about the page. So we're going to do something like that here as a demo, and then we will look at how to take that same logic and use it to build a meaningful part of our application. So the demo first will, it'll just be a way to practice the syntax, and then meaningful application afterwards. So to kick things off, I want to create a new component. Let's call this Rainbow Click component. So Rainbow Click JS, and you'll notice that I am using all lowercase file names with dashes in between the words, so kebab case. Other teams will structure things as Pascal case, where every word is uppercase with no dashes. It doesn't really matter as long as you structure your application in a consistent way and you name files the same way. One recommendation is just make sure that you're not putting spaces inside your file names. So what I want to do here is create the basic structure for our React component. So I'm importing React from React, and then I am creating a function called Rainbow Click. And this is going to return some markup. For now, let's just do main and say Rainbow Click so that we can see something showing up on the page. And then I want to export default this Rainbow Click. So I'm going to save this. Nothing will change about our application right now because we haven't actually used this component anywhere. So if I want this to show up on the page, I need to go back to app, which is our sort of entry point for everything that is rendered. We saw that we were rendering app to our root element on the page. So when we want something to show up, we should add it to our app here. I'm going to get rid of these welcome messages. And let's get rid of main, and let's just return Rainbow Click. And one of the nice things about Visual Studio Code is you can see that it actually added that import for me as I was typing Rainbow Click. It noticed that that is a variable that has been exported from this file and automatically added the import syntax. If that didn't happen for you, you just have to come up here and type in import Rainbow Click from the file path. So if I save this and check out the browser, I should see Rainbow Click printing out. So we've got our component mounting to the page, which is good. Let's go back to Rainbow Click and let's finish this markup here. So I'm going to create a main, and then I want to create an H1 that is our clicky state demo. We are going to have some text that shows up that says you've clicked X number of times. And then let's have a button that says click me. Save it, check it out. So this we want to update. So when we want to store a piece of information that the user interface needs to react to, that's where we need to start digging into state. So let me show you the basic syntax to get this working, and then we will deconstruct it and make sense of it. So inside this function, what I want to do is use something called array destructuring to get a num clicks variable and a function that allows me to set the num clicks. And this is going to be equal to use state, which is something that I need to import from React. Visual Studio is picking up that that is a possible thing that I might want to do automatically. So if I click on that, it will import it for me. I'm going to pass in a default state here. Then I'm going to give myself curly brackets so that I can inject some JavaScript here and put in num clicks, so passing in this variable. And right now we should just see you've clicked 0 times. On button click is this function that we set number of clicks to num clicks plus 1. And then my button, I am going to register the onClick event handler. So when onClick is, when the button is clicked on, this is the function that runs. So now every time I click this button, that number goes up on the page, and our page is reactively re-rendering to that number. So anytime I click, React is taking care of updating the text on the page to match. So let's break this down. There are a couple of things that are new that happened here. One is that we used this useState function that comes from React. So useState is one way for us to introduce state into our application. There is a class-based way of doing it if we structured our components as classes, but useState is something called a hook, and it is the most modern way to introduce state into our application. Let's pull up the documentation for useState. So the documentation page for useState talks about, essentially this example that we just created here, talks about how you would do this if you were doing the equivalent class-based version, and then talks about what a hook is, and keep scrolling. Actually, I want the hooks API reference. So this, if I look at useState, what it's telling me is that we pass in the initial state to this function, and it gives us back the current value plus a function for us to update that value. So if I flip back, what we're getting here is the current value of the number of clicks, which starts at 0, which is what I passed in here. And then it gives us a function that we can use to update the number of clicks. So when we call this down here, set num clicks, we pass in what the new value of num clicks should be. And what happens under the hood is that React knows that this state is something that this component uses. So anytime this function is executed, go ahead and re-render this so that the latest version of num clicks shows up on the page. So React is taking care of holding on to the latest value of num clicks and giving it back to us anytime we call this function here, useState. And if we were to, let's see what happens if I'm going to make this let so that I can update the value of num clicks. If I were to try to update this value myself directly by just taking that variable and adding 1 to it, rerunning the page, we can see that nothing is changing about our application. And that's because this method is the thing that allows React to know that we have changed something about our state and that our user interface needs to react to it. So these variables that you get back from useState, you should not be manipulating directly, like you should not be mutating them. You should be using the setter function that comes with it to change the value. So let me go back to the working version. And I'll add a note here. Don't try to mutate the state directly. Use the setter. Okay, so peeling back the layers of information, we also are using a new piece of syntax that we haven't talked about here called array destructuring. So let's put a little example up here at the top of the file. Array destructuring is just a way that we can take elements out of an array and put them into variables. So it's similar to when we did our object destructuring here, where we pulled out greeting and name from this object that had greeting and name properties. Let's flip back. So it might look like if we had this array, let's say we had an array of fruit and we had a kiwi and an apple banana. Array destructuring allows us to say item 1, item 2, item 3 equals fruit. So the first element from the array will get pulled out and put into this variable, the second one into this one, and the third one into this one. And we can name these whatever we want. There's no reason why it has to be called item 1, item 2, item 3. We could have said this is fruit 1, fruit 2, fruit 3. And let me print these out to the browser so you can see them. And you know what? I am going to just move this into our component so that this code runs when our component is rendered. So we should be able to see this in our browser now. When our component is rendered, we see those 3 variables printed out: kiwi, apple, banana. So looking at this line of code with the array destructuring in mind, all this is doing when we call setState is we're being given back an array, and we are saying num clicks equals array 0 and set num clicks equals array 1. So that's all we're doing is destructuring, and those variables that we choose here are up to us. I could have just called this clicks instead of num clicks, and that would have been perfectly fine. Let me undo this and go back to what we had. The names of these variables, that's completely up to us. But what it's giving back to us, the first parameter is the state, and the second parameter is the function that we should use to update that state. So if we want to add more state to our application, it's just a matter of calling useState again. So I can say useState, and let's say that we want to store the player's name to be able to include it in this message up here. So then I just name these whatever I want. So I can call this name, I can call this player name, and then the second parameter here of this destructuring is the setter. So I can call it something like set player name. And you'll see me use this convention of the variable name over here, and then the setter is just called set plus the variable name. You don't have to, there's no restriction inside of React that forces you to use this, but it is good practice to name your state variables and your setters consistently. So if I inject this into the page, player name, it's going to start off as an empty string, so nothing is going to show up here. But if I wanted to, let's wrap this in a div. And let's give us another div here with an input element. So an input element, this is just an HTML element. This has nothing to do with React specifically. It is an element on the page that allows you to enter in text, a single line of text. So this input element, I can tell it that its value is equal to our player name. So whatever the player's name is at any moment in time will show up in this input box. Again, empty string, but if I said, default name in here, default name will show up in this text box, and default name will show up here. I can register an Onchange handler. So Onchange is called anytime the value of this text input is changed. In a similar way that, onClick is called anytime this button is clicked on. So I can say on name input change is a function. This is going to take one parameter, and actually our on button click also takes a parameter. Let's print out console.log event.target, and we can do that up here as well for demo purposes, and make sure that this gets bound here. So I'm saying that the function that should be called on this input element on change is equal to this function up here. pop open my console window. I click on my button. We can see event.target is a reference to that HTML element. And as we saw in the quiz game, event.target allows us to access, say, like the inner HTML. And we get the text. With the event.target for our input, if I flip back and I start typing, we can see every time I hit a key, this function gets run and we see our input print out. And if I print out the value of event.target, every time I run it, it is giving me that default name plus the key that I just pressed. So here I typed a bunch of gibberish, but if I type in 1, then 1 shows up, 2 shows up. So on change, this value here is giving us back the value that we want to use to set the player's name. So let's pull this out into a variable. Const value is equal to event.target.value. We will print out value, and then we will call set player name with that value. So what this is doing is every time we press a key, it is registering that the player's name has changed and gives our setter here the player's name, that value, which is, whatever it started at when the component rendered, plus one more character. So if I refresh it, come back here, as I delete this, we are seeing the value print out, and then it is also dynamically updating our page. So as I type in my name, it updates both in the text box here and updates on the page. So we've got two pieces of state that reactively re-render our page. So looking at this code again, we have these use state. These are how we get little pieces of state, little pieces of data that we are able to then register with React that when this is changed, our interface needs to update. So we can't just mutate these variables directly. We also just can't create our own variables and expect them to update on the page accordingly. This is the way that we have to define our state, our data that is a part of our application, the data that changes, that sort of needs to cause a reaction in our user interface. These don't have to be individual primitives like number and string. These could be collections. So I could have a variable for the player inventory. Player inventory, set player inventory, and use state and have an array in there, or like player stats and set player stats and pass in an object literal, and it could be like the age and the score and whatever else you want to include here. So your state is anything that you want to pass into here. It could be any JavaScript variable. So we're not using these, so I'm just going to comment these out. Okay, other new things that we introduced here is, let's see. Right, other new things that we introduced, we've got Onchange and OnClick. So inside of the vanilla JavaScript world, we were getting a reference using document.querySelector and then saying add event listener for a click. But in the React world, we don't do that. We specify what the handlers are for events in line here. And if I just hit control space, let's type on, and then that will pop up some of our completes here. So these are all of the handlers for HTML elements. So we have things like on mouse down, on mouse move that we can register to our DOM elements. And we'll start with on click and on change, and we'll introduce more as we need them. So let's add a little bit more. I called this rainbow click because I want to change the color of our page based on the number of clicks. So we haven't talked about this yet, but if we want to apply style to individual elements on our page, we can actually just specify style inline here. So this first set of brackets is giving me the ability to inject some JavaScript, and this second set of brackets here is me declaring an object literal. So for instance, if I wanted to say that the background color is black and the color is white, I can do that using this JavaScript syntax. And if I flip back, we will see that has updated. The difference between this and when we write CSS is that here we can't do kebab case in like the CSS syntax. This will give us an error because the dash is not a valid name, a valid character to use in our variable names. So everything has to be translated, to Pascal case. So the word that dash will be removed, and then every word after the first word will have a capital letter. This kind of styling is useful for one-off styling elements. Like, I just want this paragraph. That's the only thing in the application that I want to apply this style to. Fine, it's okay to do this. Generally, we want to use CSS to apply our styles because it allows us to, say, create a class that we could apply here or on, other pages. But this style is also a good thing for us to use when we have a property that needs to change dynamically. So for instance, if I want this background color to be like HSL, and then I want to pass in like the number of clicks here for the hue, and let's just put in 100% saturation, 50% lightness, or maybe 25% lightness, and this we want to put the number of clicks here, we can do that. So that would be a valid use case for having this style being applied to an element. So we can see our HSL showing up here. To make this a little bit more clear, I'm going to pull the style out and call this text style into an object literal up here. So I'm going to use this variable in place of this object. Whoops, there we go. So I just want to take this object and place it in here, which keeps the markup a little bit more readable down here. So then I'm going to say the background color. I'm going to give myself a template string so that I can inject some JavaScript in here. So these are the backticks that you will find also on the key that gives you a tilde. So they're not single quotes or double quotes. We want 100% saturation, 50% or 30% lightness, and we also want the color to be white. Let's add some padding as we're here anyway. So let's add like a padding of 1 rem. So if I save this, I should see that style be applied here in the browser. And then it's just a matter of figuring out how we want to use the number of clicks here. So if I just pass in num clicks, that value is going to start at 0, which is red, and then every time I click, the hue will step up slightly. But this number goes from 0 to 360, so every time I click it, I'm going to click it really a lot to start to get the hue to change. Instead, what I could do is create a new variable here, and let's call this hue, and set it equal to something like, num clicks times 10. So now instead of having to click 360 times to go through here, I only have to click 36 times to go through all of the hues. So it's jumping more quickly now. This will eventually get out of the range of 0 to 360, but actually browsers will take whatever value you give them here and kind of wrap them around, so you end up with something between 0 and 360. So even if I jump by 100 and flip back and run this, every time I click it, even though I'm now at like 1000 for the hue, it knows what that would be in terms of 0 to 0 to 360. So we don't have to do much here. You just figure out what step you want to do. Maybe you want to go up by 15 each time. And one key distinction here between the value of hue, which we are also updating every time the application state changes. This is not a state variable directly. We didn't call use state and create the hue, but we calculate this directly from some piece of state. Here it's the num clicks. So this, by virtue of the fact that it is based on num clicks, will reactively re-render, will reactively change the background color when the number of clicks changes. So I want to add one comment before we leave this behind, and I want to document what we said about the styling here, that this is useful when you want to apply style that is dynamic in some nature. So I'm going to add a comment here, but you'll see that if I start typing 2 backslashes and save this, that is actually being interpreted as content that should show up on the page. So if we want to put comments inside of our JSX, this extended JavaScript syntax down here, what we need to do is open up a comment inside of brackets that indicate that this is JavaScript. So I'm going to say the styling here that is applied, or actually let's say applying style this way is useful for dynamic styles, e.g. styles that change with the state. Oops, I guess let's get rid of the parentheses there. So injecting comments this way is a little bit weird, admittedly, and cumbersome, but this is how you would put a comment inside of your JSX. Up here, outside of JSX, these comments, our normal JavaScript comments, are perfectly valid. So we've effectively been able to add some state to our application using a hook, a thing in React called a hook, and we're specifically using the use state hook. There are other types of hooks that we'll get into, but they essentially allow us to use aspects of the React lifecycle in our application. There are a couple rules to using hooks that are outlined here in rules for hooks, and they're important to keep in mind if you run into errors as you're working on your React application. So you should only call hooks from the top level of whatever the scope is that you're in, and you should only call them from React functions. So that would be from a component or from a custom hook that you create. So for instance, if I had a conditional here, and there was some Boolean variable for this condition, if I put use state inside of here, we are now no longer at the top of a React function. We are within this code block. This will break the use state hook. So we can't actually nest our hooks like this into if statements into loops. All right, let's get rid of this and let's start working on a new component. So I want to create a component that demos how to use state again, but this time it'll be a demo tied to our application. So we'll create a little introduction page where the player can enter their name, they can configure how many questions they want in this round of trivia, and then they can maybe also have a drop down for picking the category of trivia. So let's shut this down and create a new component called new game form. Anytime we are writing JSX, we need to import React at the top. And let's create our new game form component that returns a form. Whoops, I misspelled that, form. And let's export default our new game form. So this won't show up on the page yet. We're gonna have to go ahead and import it into app and use it. But a couple of things that I want to point out. So you may have seen me import React in files where we don't actually use React anywhere. And this is part of the compile step. This is necessary to be imported anytime there is JSX syntax in the file. So this has to be here for all our components. So that's one thing I wanted to point out. The other thing is that you've seen me write these functions where previously I told you that we use camel case. So if we were writing just a normal old function in a vanilla JavaScript file, we would have written this in camel case, but by convention, components in React are Pascal case, so uppercase first letter. So that should help explain some of the syntax that's going on in these basic component files. So let's get this loading on our page. Let's give it a rainbow click. Drop in new game form. And this, as I was typing, I allowed it to autocomplete, which pulled in the import statement at the top. If your setup doesn't do that, then just make sure that you're importing new game form at the top here. Flip back, we should see new form. And let's look at a couple of pages in the browser. So let's look up some documentation pages here. We're going to use the form HTML element and input HTML element. So form elements is in HTML are used to sort of wrap up a bunch of inputs that are then when you hit the submit button, usually sent to like a server. In our case, we are just going to use it to wrap up a bunch of inputs that we are going to collect locally. We're not going to send it off to a server. But a form is usually composed of these input elements. So input elements, let's grab the MDN page because they have some good documentation here. The same element is used to represent a whole bunch of different types of inputs. So for instance, we used input of type text in the last component, but there are a whole bunch of other ones. There are ones for passwords where when you type in them, the characters are not shown as visible. There's inputs for collecting files, color, checkbox. So we're going to dig into a couple of these over the course of building this application. Like we're going to use number in a second here, which will allow us to enter numbers, but not allow us to enter in letters. So we're going to use form, we're going to use input, and then it's also worthwhile to pull up the React page for forms. So React has a documentation page that talks about how we represent forms on the page, talks about a couple of different elements, like text area is slightly different than input. It is for defining an area that has multiple lines or potentially multiple lines of text. It talks about the select tag, which allows us to create a dropdown. So we'll come back and refer to some of these. But what I want to point out here is that we are going to use the structure of having a label and an input element together inside of our form. So let's start building it out. Inside of our form, we can get rid of this text, and I'm going to want to create 3 rows. So let's get 3 divs. Actually, let's create 4 divs here. And in the first div, I'm going to need a label and an input of type text. I'm using the emit expansion here to type in the input and type together. We're not going to need a name. Inside the second div, I'm going to want a label and an input of type number. This one we're going to want a select that is filled with a couple of options. I'm going to mostly leave this blank. We'll come back and fill out that drop down. And then the last row here, we want an input of type submit. Whoops, submit. That says play. Okay, so let's just take a quick look at what we got here, and I'll bring them up side by side. So this top one is our text input, allows me to type in text. This next one is our number input, allows me to type in numbers, but doesn't allow me to type in text. This next one is an empty dropdown, which we will fill in with more options. And then there is a submit button, or sort of an input of type submit, which is rendered like a button, but when we click it, it actually goes ahead and submits that form. So, okay, let's flip back and start filling this out. So I want to create some text in this label that says enter name, enter number of questions, and check it out. We can see the label appearing next to our input. The HTML4 attribute here is an attribute that is equivalent to the for attribute in regular HTML. So because for is a reserved word in JavaScript, there's this different attribute inside of JSX that we have to use here, but it's a way for us to link our label to an input element. So for instance, if I link this by putting an ID of name, HTML4 name, this label is now linked to this input. So if I click on it, this input focuses. So this is really important for accessibility reasons. You can see that this other one doesn't do that because I haven't linked them yet. So here I'm going to make sure this will be questions, this will be questions. And now they're linked together. So if I click on the label, it will focus on the appropriate element. Let's start building out the state that is associated with this. So we are going to need a state for representing the player's name. We need some state to represent the number of questions. Oh, actually, let's default that to be like 10. And we're going to need some state for the category. And we're going to store the category by ID. So we're going to have like essentially a number that represents which category we currently have selected. So I've got 3 pieces of state that I now need to link up to these 3 inputs. So for our input here, we specify the value to say that it should be driven by our piece of state here. So for this one, I want to say the value is name. For this one, the value is num questions. And we'll work on the category after we get the first 2 working. So right now, we should see 10 showing up and an empty string showing up here. And because we haven't handled the change events, these forms are essentially static. I can't enter anything in them. So what we need to do is handle the change event for the input and update our name, and handle the change event for this input and update our number of questions. So I'm going to create 2 event handler functions. This is on name change. And we want one for on num questions change. And both of these can take an event parameter. And as we saw on the other page, inside of Rainbow Click, we can get the event.target.value to grab whatever the current value in the DOM element is at any moment. So I can just do set name and pass that in, and set num questions and pass that in. So the on change event, we are now binding it to this on name change function, and the on change event here we bind to the on num questions change. Give this a save, check it out in the browser. So now I can start typing in my name, how many questions I want, and eventually we'll be able to hit play and pull all of that information out of the form. Let's flip back to that component, and let's start working on this dropdown that fills in the category. So we're going to be storing the category as an ID, as a number, and the way that a dropdown works is that we can specify the contents of the dropdown, so the text that appears on the screen here. So we can say like general knowledge, entertainment, books, science, and we'll fill these in with the values from the Trivia API later. So this content, if I save it and flip back to the browser, is what shows up in the dropdown. This value is what gets given back to us when we read the value of our select. So on the on change in the Onchange handler that we're going to register here, we're going to get back these values when the player selects one of these. So we don't need the name or the ID here, but we do need to say that on change, we're going to run our on category change, and we'll come up here and create that function now. So on category change is equal to an event where we are going to set category and use the event.target.value. So we also need to say that the value of the select at any moment in time is the category variable from our use state up here. So we should now have a functional drop down that changes the state. And now what we want to do is add something, some code that runs when this button is clicked. So a button has an on-click event, and we could have put a button here, but a input of type submit causes the form's submit event to be triggered. And so we can instead listen for on submit and bind a on form submit arrow function to that event. One of the things that you need to do with a form that is not intended to send the result of what's in the form to a server is prevent the default action. So event.prevent default will prevent the default browser action associated with the event. So if that's like a right click, that means prevent the right click menu, the context menu, from showing up. For a form, that means don't try and send this information in the URL to a server. So if I uncomment this and we click the play button, you can see that the browser quickly loaded a new page, and this question mark showed up at the end of our URL here. And let's go back, and if I prevent the default and hit play, now nothing happens. Nothing reloaded. There's no question mark in our URL. So we've prevented that default behavior. And then just for the sake of demo purposes, let's alert the contents. So let's alert the name, the num questions, and the category. Whoops. New game for name with num questions and category, or num questions from category. So I can put in my name, I can say I want 50 questions from entertainment books, new game for Mike with 50 from category 12. Oh, I forgot to say questions there, but you get the idea that we now have all of this information from our form when that button is clicked. Just fix the sentence and add a period here. So this alert is a placeholder. We will come back and replace this later, but this, when the player clicks on submit, if they've entered valid information, should be kicked over to a new game. And that's, well, I'll put a to-do note here. To-do, kick off the game instead of alerting. But we have to learn something called routing before we can do that. So we'll come back and fix this. What I do want to add while we're at it is what is often called validation logic. So if I go back to the page here, I can try and start a game without entering my name, and that's completely fine. Nothing stops me. I can also ask for a really large number of questions or a negative number of questions, which doesn't really make sense. So often what you want to do with your forms is make sure that the input is valid when the player is finished with the form. So there are a couple ways that we can do this. One type of validation we can run is here. So So for instance, when they are ready to start the game, we want to make sure that they've actually entered a name. And the way that we can do that is to check whether this name state variable up here is still equal to an empty string. So if they haven't put anything in, then we could alert, please enter a name. And let's also, we will return here. So if we return inside of a function, that means end the function. So we're essentially ending this early, which is equivalent to us having said something like this, where this alert will only show up if the name is valid. But returning early is a common pattern that you'll see out in the world, so I'll demo it here. And we can say this halts the function early. So now we could try it entering a name. Let's leave it blank, hit play, please enter a name. So we'd be prevented from starting the game until we go back and enter a name. Another type of validation we can run is actually on inputs as they are typed in. So for instance, this num questions, maybe we want to keep it between a min and max value and not let the user even get to the place of typing in an invalid number, like a negative number. So we can do a couple of things here. We can come down to our input element that is of type number. We can specify a min and a max. Maybe the max is 50. So the min and max here are applied to the increment and decrement buttons. So as I click them, I can't go below 1, and if I clicked all the way up to 50, I couldn't go above 50, but I can actually still type in invalid numbers. Those aren't going to be filtered out by the min and max. But what I can do is come up to my onNumberChange function and check that value and make sure that that value is within some bounds. So let's refactor this slightly. So we're going to grab the min. We can grab that min value that we set here as a string and the max value as a string from event.target.min and event.target.max. But these are going to come back to us as strings, so what we want to do is parse them to an integer. So remember, we saw how to parse int and parse float when we were learning about prompting the user with modal windows. So here we're parsing the min and max, and let's also do the same thing for our value to ensure that it is an integer. Event.target.value. And what we want to do is, if that value that the user typed is less than our min, then let's just set the number of questions to be our min. Let's not even let them use that value. Else, if the value is greater than our max, we will set the number of questions directly to our max. And if our value doesn't meet either of those, that means that it is in between our min and max, then we can set num questions to our value. So if I flip back and run it, if I try and type like 1000, it's taking me directly to 50. And if I try and type like negative, it's not letting me type anything negative. So I used an abbreviated syntax here for the clauses here. So if you omit the brackets for your code, for your clauses, for your if, else, it just includes the next statement in the body of that condition. So it's as if I had written this, where each statement was wrapped in a code block to indicate that it was inside of this, the body of this if clause. So I'll probably leave the code this way, just letting you know that these two are equivalent, and as you're starting to learn programming in JavaScript, it is often good to write it in this longer form, as you're less likely to make a mistake that way. So looking at our component here, there are plenty of things that we could continue to improve, like this alert message. Usually you don't want to use an alert message. We could create another piece of state here that is an error message, and instead of displaying an alert, we could use our JSX down here to display that error message conditionally if we've got one, and disable the submit button until that error goes away. But I think the last thing I want to do here is include some styling to make our form look a little bit better. And we'll get the header and the footer in here in the next video, but this is a little hard to look at. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up the structure, then I'll pause the video while I write some of the CSS and unpause it and just walk through, since the styling is not super important and is stuff that you know how to do at this point. So what I'm going to do is create a new file called newgameform.css, and it's common in the React world to have a JavaScript file and then a CSS file that's associated with it. So you may name them the same thing, like newgameform. And what I want to do is import that CSS so that the CSS gets included in our application. And then fill out this CSS in BEM styling. So I'm going to pause the video, and then you'll see a bunch of styling suddenly appear. All right, so here is some of the styling. I'm using BEM and the component I'm calling GameForm, and then I have a couple of different elements within that. So there's the form itself where we set some of the width. There is our row, which we set up with some spacing, the labels, the actual inputs, change some of the color and font sizing, and the submit button. So all I'm going to do is start applying these back to my new game form. So up here at the top, my class name is game form. And if I save it, that should now be applied. So we can see some margin being applied and the width changing. And one important note is that if we don't import this CSS, that does not get applied. So when we are in React world and using Create React App, we have to import our CSS into our JavaScript files to actually bring it into our final build. So let's keep filling this out. I am going to insert multiple cursors here by holding down Control, and then type out class name game form row, which should give us some spacing. And then on my labels, I want to do the same thing. Class name game form label. And let's do the same thing here on each input. Game form input. And also on the select. Styles each of those. And class name game form submit here to give us some styling on the button. So I will make this styling available. This will all be, I'll have a link in the canvas so that you can drop this into your project. You know what? Now that I'm looking at it, I think I want to add one more thing. I want to add a label here to this dropdown to make this look a bit more consistent. So label HTML4, I'm going to have to create an ID for this select so that they are linked together. Category, pick a category, and this now has to have the ID that matches to link these two together. And the label, I also want to apply this class name. There we go. That looks a bit better. So that's it for this new game form and the associated CSS. One thing that's important to note is the reason why we're using BEM styling here is because the CSS that we write in this file, there's no guarantee that this is sort of locally scoped to this file. So if in another file, like in main.css, we had styling for a different game form, we would have competing styles. So this BEM styling convention allows us to kind of separate our CSS out into separate files and have a little bit of a guarantee that we're not going to have scope conflicts where selector conflicts where our names are going to conflict with one another as long as we use this BEM style. There are other ways to do styling in React, like there are JavaScript solutions that actually will locally scope this for us, and hopefully we'll get to see some of those in a couple videos. But for now, this will work fine. So we saw how to use state to create a couple of different types of components, and in the next video we're going to learn how to use something called a dependency, and specifically React Router, to create it so that we can go to multiple pages within this application. Oh, and I think I'm going to make one more tweak. Now that I'm looking at this and seeing some of the styling here, I can see that there's some inconsistent sizing, and some of the fonts that are being used here aren't the same font. So we got some mixed fonts here. So I'm going to do something called a reset, where you just change some of the base properties of your HTML elements, sometimes also referred to as a normalize, that will give you more of a clean slate across browsers. So for one of them, what I want to do is we're setting the font family on all of the elements. I also, through this body tag, which is this style is inherited by all the child elements, but some of the elements actually, like the inputs, won't inherit that by default. So what I'm going to do is create a rule here that applies to everything, and I'm going to specifically say all elements on the page should inherit their font family. And if I flip back, now the font that's being loaded in here is PT Sans and matches for our inputs and our submit button, our drop down, our text inputs, our number inputs. And then the other one that I want to do in terms of reset is border box, is box sizing, border box. And you can see that clears up some of the inconsistency that was happening here. And to finish out that, I want to do something else that's really common to do when you change the box sizing. So this is probably a little bit easier explained if we pull up the documentation for box sizing. So box sizing allows us to control how the width, height, margin, padding, and border are calculated. So by default, it is not border box. So for instance, here, the content box sizing, when we specify the width of something, so here this child element's width is set to 100% of its parent, and then the border and padding are added on top of that width. So the final width is actually larger than the parent container. But when you use border box for the box sizing, the border and padding come out of the width of the child container. So when we say it's 100% of the parent, when we add border and we add padding, those come out of that width. So we don't get the child element extending outside the container. So it's really common to do this kind of reset to border box. Border box is oftentimes a little bit easier to think about. And it also cleared up the inconsistency we had going on here. So that's it for this video. Next time we will talk about dependencies, routing, and making multiple pages within our application.